Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar. The webinar today is on open banking, charting industry progress and exploring complementary data sets. My name is Danny Gow and I'm the Chief Revenue Officer at Validis. Validis is a UK headquartered fintech that's working with lenders and accountants globally to access real-time SME financial data. The purpose of today's webinar is to explore how far we've come with open banking and complementary data sets, the challenges we have overcome to date, and the challenges in front of us. We'll specifically focus on supporting SME businesses, and we will end today's webinar discussing API-enabled data connectivity in today's digital economy and the value of management accounts combined with open banking data. We will discuss the question often asked about how do you reconcile bank account data with the ledgers and the fraud risk associated with this. I'm delighted today to be joined by Richard Davies, Commercial Banking Director for SME Banking at TSB, and Nick Vanstone, Senior Consultant in the Decision Analytics business of Experian. There is a supporting advisory note to today's webinar that we'll be launching very soon, so please look out for that. We will be emailing you the paper along with the slides after the webinar. If you'd rather not receive the materials, then please just let us know. The discussion today will last an hour and there will be extra time for questions at the end, so please use the question panel on your machine to send those through. There is also a small poll question that will be open throughout, and we will look at the results at the end. Let's kick off the discussion by understanding more about my co-speakers. Richard, can you give a little bit more context to your background and your role?
Sure, thanks, Danny. So, as mentioned, I head up SME Banking at TSB. So I joined at the start of the year and very much looking to help drive a step change in the services provided to SME customers. My background is a variety of banks, HSBC, Oak North, Barclays, and I've got a pretty deep interest in how you can use design thinking and some innovation around technology to help SME customers.
Great. And Nick, I think I'm not mistaken by calling you a lifer in the data and decision analytics industry.
Yes. So I've been at Experian probably 20 years. I'm on my 21st year, so obviously I enjoy it there. And that's in a variety of roles across the use of data, the use of decisioning, mainly in banking, but across both the UK and South Africa. And also within my current role, it's actually around the use of data within a commercial environment. So both across lending, but also managing customers on that front.
Great. Discussing with many industry leaders and asking them why now for sharing of this information. We'll get a view on the government push later on, but it's quite clear the power of choice for consumers has allowed us to, at a click of a button, shop for almost anything, anywhere, anytime. I even last week heard about applying for credit through Alexa, and also around mobile banking. On average, today, the average consumer clicks on their mobile banking app 28 times a month. We are now in an open data arena to allow for more intelligent decisions. Imran, who is seconded from EY to lead the open banking implementation, stated at the Experian conference last week that 2019 is the year for open banking. He talked a lot about consumers and SMEs taking back control of their data and mentioned 1.5 million unbanked, 4 million unable to get credit, and a further 12 million with the wrong product, which is causing friction in the system. Richard, let's start with a nice easy question for you. How far have we actually come and how far have banks progressed with open banking?
Sure. So, I mean, a brief history clearly is that, as you mentioned, the CMA inquiry from 2014 to 2016 looked at retail and SME banking in the UK. I was at HSBC at the time and played some small part in the rise of open banking because I advocated quite strongly to the panel that was in that CMA inquiry that we should mandate open banking in the UK ahead of the Payment Service Directive 2 coming in Europe. So we've clearly had both the sort of public data phase, so the public data on products going live, in the UK. And then more recently this year, over the last 9 months, the CMA 9 banks, and 9 banks that were mandated by the CMA, going live with a set of basic account information and payment initiation services, really centered around current accounts. So I think it's taken quite a lot of effort for those banks to get there. They did get some extensions on the deadline, but I think they're all pretty much there now. And I guess we've got then the next major step is PSD2 coming in Europe next year, which will tie up all the other UK banks to deliver functionality under open banking, as well as all of Europe. And it will also extend the functionality of the CMA 9. So essentially under PSD2, you've got to provide functionality across all payment accounts, not just current accounts, and also replicate any functionality you have in your digital channels. So first, there's a lot going on. I think for SMEs, a lot of the functionality comes next year rather than this year, in terms of that richness of account types and payment functionality, which comes under sort of the PSD2 next year. But certainly quite a lot of progress in the last 2 or 3 years from pretty much a standing start.
Great. And Nick, as an extremely interested non-banking stakeholder to open banking, what have you observed so far around the implementation?
It's an interesting question, I suppose. The data isn't new from, if we take lending, people have been using bank statements for years across both consumer and commercial lending. And so it's a very sort of manual process. So the actual principles of it are not actually new, but the ability to actually consume the data is obviously the new one in a real-time environment. And I think we see from our perspective is that consumer has been in the vanguard of this. A lot of the use cases have been created around consumer banking, and actually they're now working and moving to the SME banking front. And there's obvious use cases why consumer, to sort of pick up some of those underserved population you touched on that sort of Imran mentioned last week. But also within SME, there is a lot more work where people are looking at, and we're seeing that not just in the UK, but also abroad.
We talked in preparation for this webinar around how M-Pesa and mobile banking in Africa many years ago now. We talked around some of the Scandinavian countries and what's happening in China and India around data and collection and consent of data. I guess my question to you is the UK ahead of other countries? And what are we seeing around the globe?
Yeah, listen, when I was at HTC, I guess had a pleasure of sort of pretty global view there. And I guess I think the UK is ahead of developed markets in general. And I think you look at Europe, for example, we've gone ahead quite a distance there, right, against PSD2 coming in next year. CMA 9 went live early this year. I think that if you kind of look at some of the emerging markets, it's quite a different story. I think India is a very interesting example, which went live at the end of 2016 with the unified payments interface, which is a sort of push and pull payment and account information service that is connected to a wide range of things. For example, Aadhaar, the digital identity database the government runs, mobile phone numbers, virtual payment accounts, QR codes. So a really extensive ecosystem there. And I think it's doing hundreds of millions of transactions a month now. So I guess in terms of like the regulatory drive, the UK is probably ahead of the developed world, but there are some very, very interesting use cases in some of the other markets around the world.
Great, thanks. And Nick, you're obviously in a global data company and have sort of had the perspective across different countries. What are you seeing UK compared to other countries?
Yeah, I think from the UK's perspective, because it's become there's a standardised approach, that's probably ahead of its game in that front, whereas actually it's less standardised in other markets, but in some places they're ahead, in others they're catching up. But also we've done some research by some partner companies on this, and actually what do SMEs struggle with? They, sometimes it's actually struggle to, what is the right product and service for them? So if I want money, what do I need money for? Is it short term? Is it long term? What do I need to back it up by some sort of facilities or security? So actually sometimes the question is, what is the right product for me? Because actually at the end of the day, an SME wants money and they want it quick and they want to understand it. So, they have concerns where they've been turned down funding. There's also the speed things take. It's long, it can be convoluted. They actually just want to run their business or get on with their business. I think sometimes there's other concerns where you see from other areas where you actually go and say, many small businesses are great at what they do. They can create these widgets, they can create these capabilities, they can serve fantastic food, but are they actually always great on managing that? So actually, are they good on managing cash flow? Are they understanding where the stresses are in their portfolio or businesses or in their actual business themselves? How do they better engage with customers? How do they actually reach out to them? Where do they have those problems? And, how do they grow? But also, things like security and safety of data and things like that. You take elements like GDPR, it's a whole new industry that's come along, and people are there's a lot of concerns. And open banking, we've been looking at how that can be used. And you take the fact of actually turning some of that statement data and that rich transactional data into intelligence to say, you know what, your business is in its current trajectory, it's going to run out of money soon. Have you chased these invoices? You imagine that you bring open banking with the statements along with the management accounts of your ledger and that lot, and go and say, by the way, this is a risk of your customers and how that things. These are the people to chase. And by the way, using that to actually then help them find new leads. But also, if it speeds up the time to cash and enables them to get the right facility to meet their needs, then actually this will be a huge, great leap forward. And that's the key thing. It's the ability to better serve the SMEs and actually give something back to them to help them manage their business. And I think there's also something about there's another side to this, which is what is the SME's view on sharing data? And, there's some, from a survey we did, who are very keen to share data to get the right product, the right price, actually be able to use it and actually enable them to do things quickly. And they're very keen. There's others that said, no, not a chance. You're not having my data. And that's there. They were, small amount. And there's a maybe, which is the largest chance for open banking to be there, is they need to trust it. And I'm looking at some of the comments here which came across. Security, 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 security. It's on every single one. They want their data to be safe. They want it to be secure. They want to ensure that it is regulated. And, they even mentioned the FCA, its forerunner, the FSA. And therefore, the principle of knowing that it is actually controlled is a key thing on that front. For those that didn't really want to share it, it was about the fact that transactions and open banking tell you a lot of things, but it's the things that are like the future. You may say, looking at the transaction, it's not a very steady business, but then you look at the sales ledger and you go, actually, it's a very healthy business. So I think you have to combine the data, and I think there's a lesson to actually go out there and say, how will this data help? One of the other things is also about the security and the safety of brand was mentioned. So I think you have to compare that with what SMEs are looking for, but also the concerns they have around sharing this data to really make it work. I think, Richard, it'd be good to get your follow-up views on that. Just to pass it back, I think you'll see from your side about, those security and brand issues are key aspects, aren't they?
Yeah, and listen, I think it's a bit like, I guess, the old days of having a safety deposit box and sticking some assets in that safety deposit box. People kind of want the virtual equivalent of that, right? If you're going to share data assets, you want to make sure that is secure. And I think there's been a lot of focus put around that from the open banking implementation entity. But I think it will take a bit of time for that trust to spread across the market. And so I do think, security for data, particularly when you see headlines like the hacks on people like BA, Facebook, etc., it becomes definitely at the forefront of quite a lot of both consumer and SME people's minds. But yeah, I think the use cases are almost endless you can think of. I mean, I agree with what you're talking about in terms of lending is a very obvious one. So it's easy to forget that only a third of SMEs actually borrow. So you've got 2/3 that don't borrow at the moment. So kind of also, what do you do for them? So things like insight, things like benchmarking, things like helping disaggregate FX, things like helping get better return on the spare funds they've got. There's many different areas you can go into that are just finance related, and then clearly you can go beyond that into how do you help simplify the business owner's life? How do you help them administer the business? How do you help them run the business? I guess across a range of different types of data, open banking being one of those, there's a really great chance to try and improve and simplify the lives of business owners, I'd say, over the next few years.
Great. And sort of a follow-up question to that, Richard. How far ahead are you looking in terms of SME strategy, and what role does data play in that?
Yeah, I've got a real hope that the industry is going to transform over the next few years. I think it's been a pretty stagnant industry for many decades, and I think it's pretty underserved. It's all treated as a one size fits all. There are definitely pockets of overpricing, and so I got this big hope that across a number of different sectors, for example, banking, accounting software, some of the fintechs, some of the sector-specific plays, for example, retailer support software, it can all really come together and help transform the lives of those business owners who ultimately experience currently a really fragmented, high-friction, excessively priced offering in the market. And I do think the core of that is data. I think if you look at whatever business model you want to put out there, be it sort of human touch, be it mobile only, be it providing rich customer insights, at the heart of all of that is actually the data that enables either the digital channel or the human channel or the customer self-serve to actually deliver what is needed. So for me, I think investing in data infrastructure capabilities, data science capabilities, AI is a pretty important part of developing the SME business.
And I mean, back to what both of you are saying, getting data and consent to data is not a new thing. And what we've seen over years is there's been lots of data sharing, most of it manual and paper-based, but actually not a lot done with it. There's not a lot of inside analytics off the back of a lot of data that's been shared today. And I certainly see this as an initiative. Again, we talked around lending, but not just for lending, of the ability to start providing benchmarks, additional insight, additional value back to SMEs in the industry as well.
Yeah.
Let's sort of move on. I'll sort of make a statement that APIs are the future. If you do not have an API strategy, you will be left behind. Let's talk about that in more detail and see if you both agree. Imran from the Implementation Committee of Open Banking also mentioned last week that in March 2019, we should expect improvements to the customer journey. He did state that it's not ideal at the moment. So that was according to him. Richard, what's your view around APIs? It feels like we're entering a new era of data connectivity. How valuable do you see connected API data sets?
Yeah, listen, I think you mentioned customer experience there. I would really start from customer rather than API. I mean, I think APIs are a totally essential sort of part of the technology landscape. But I guess the ability to do connections and to exchange data is not a new thing. And I think it was sometime like 12 years ago, Jeff Bezos said Amazon kind of should go API first, including internally. So this is not like some brand new revolution. I think you've got to start with what's the customer use case? How do I create value for the customer? And you look at someone like Uber, who I guess historically has aggregated a set of APIs, be it map APIs, be it payment APIs, into an app, and through that created a platform for amalgamating the demand and supply of transport. And so for me, it's about the real design thinking around what's the jobs the customer's trying to get done, and how can we use technology like APIs to better solve for those jobs to be done. I wouldn't start with the API itself, but I think you've got to start with the customer problem and then work out how does data and APIs and other technology really solve that.
Great. Nick, what other data sets can play an important role in SME lending?
Well, I think we still have to, I mean, obviously obvious coming from someone who works at a credit reference agency, but, we can't forget the traditional data assets that are there and have underpinned the system for a long time. And there's an important point there, because when we look at lending, we are, in a sense, wanting to tick a number of boxes. Box one, we need to cover things from an anti-money laundering and financial crime perspective. We need to cover things from a credit risk perspective. Are we going to get paid? Can the actual company service the borrowing that they're taking on? And also, are we being taken for a ride? That we can understand what their borrowing is today, what's the outstanding, are they a good borrower or a bad borrower on that front? there's the actual, we touched on earlier about the mandatory data sharing and how actually the government has forced banks to share more data to help open up that market. And that's a real sea change that we're seeing. And that's those traditional elements. But then overlay on top of that open banking, overlay management accounts, then actually you have in a real-time environment the ability to, better understand the risks of a business, better understand their capability of servicing the debt. And I think we look back to the principles of what are we trying to understand? We're trying to understand the character. We're trying to understand the capacity of the business to set up, understanding the capital behind it, whether there's any collateral, what the conditions are. So we want confidence. And actually, any data that can underpin that. And actually, we see more data coming online with, there's a huge raft of data out there on the data on the business in the web. How well set up is it? How well is it trading? What is it actually doing on that front? And the data on the web actually helps pick up from a financial crime perspective. Can we actually ease the burden straight through process? Can we actually use the data to get a view on the confidence of that business? And then actually, it's got a good foundation. It's there in the Google rankings. It's got all those. What about if we can then start harnessing other days to likes, if we're looking at the restaurant sector and that lot? Or actually, how much does it add? But I think it's about a picture and it's about, a jigsaw. And how do we actually put all those pieces of the jigsaw together most effectively to be able to get the best picture of this SME, of this business, and what it requires to be able to offer it the right service. So it's not just about lending. It's about lending the right product. So how can we use data to actually go and say, your need is this, we see from the data it's that. What about these options? What are the right terms for them? What are the right prices for those? So actually, I think, the data to be used goes across not just credit, where we traditionally think, but actually across how we actually sell a product. And that's a key benefit, I think.
Moving on to sort of what we're seeing in the market around technology firms partnering with other technology firms. We're seeing bank partnering with fintech. Richard, how has the bank technology partner relationship changed in the last few years?
Probably not enough, simply. I mean, I guess I think all banks are playing around with fintech programs, but if I'm sort of cutting, most banks have sort of got more pilots than BA, and very few things are actually in scale, in production. So for me, I think the interesting question is which banks are going to get really good at partnering? Because I think, I know a lot of banks announce budgets of 2, 5, 15 billion on digital, but I do think to think you can build everything yourself is really arrogant, actually. And there was some amazing talent out there in a hugely diverse range of fintech firms. And I think the interesting question is, how do you get good at partnering? There's clearly a lot to that in terms of, yes, technology integration, but actually there's far more to it than that in terms of the sort of risk management around that partnership, how you think about brand, how you think about legal, all those sort of pieces. But I think the winners over the next 5-10 years will be the firms that really can partner well to harness their own unique attributes and to get some of the innovation, some of the talent, some of the thinking that's out there in the wider market, and to really therefore create a service for the customer that is truly different and truly suits their needs.
When are we going to stop collecting data manually? When will that be a thing of the past?
So when are we going to stop collecting data manually? Honestly, I think it's a little way off. I mean, I think we talked about the progress on open banking from a sort of supply side, where there's been reasonable progress, albeit the customer experience is sadly poor in a few cases, and therefore the new guidelines coming in. But the actual adoption of open banking is extremely low so far. So there is kind of a reality check about how quickly these things will get adopted in the market. I always like to cite contactless as a good example, where I remember being back at Barclays when that was being introduced, and then TfL got behind it, and then some merchants got behind it. Here we are sort of 10, 12 years later, and it's mass adopted everywhere. But it's quite a slow journey often to get there. So I don't see, sadly, paper and manual going away particularly quickly. But I do think there's a big role for accounting software to play probably faster than open banking, frankly, in helping make things more automated for SMEs. I think if you look at the likes of Xero, QuickBooks, Sage, they've all progressed a lot and invested a lot in cloud-based accounting software for clients. They've got good adoption of that, and they're all building ecosystems around that, including APIs. And so I think there's a really interesting piece there around that's a richness of data sources that Nick was talking about earlier. And in particular, I think the one that's leading right now is that accounting software space.
Great. And Nick, same question to you. You work in a data tech company. When will people stop collecting, and specifically lenders, stop collecting those manual spreadsheets and PDFs and all that thing in the past?
In my case now, in the case of Mrs. Vanstone, probably about 30 years' time. Anyhow, there is a cultural thing about that liking paper. Some people do. In the case of Mrs. Vanstone, that's a very good example. But there's some interesting things. Paper comes, risks and documents and that lot. But I go, and I keep wandering off to South Africa. I have fond memories of going there. And actually, there was a good story there where a bank, as part of their onboarding process, had created a sort of management accounts package. And they were actually using that and were using the data within their sort of lending processes. And they got to the point where, actually, if you wanted the accounts package and you weren't willing to share with the bank, you paid for it. Whereas actually, if you were willing to share the data so they could better manage your business, actually it became free. And you look at that and go and say, there is a value exchange there. We will give something for you, but we will get something back. And I think the thing is about the data is there is a value exchange concept here to actually sharing my data to actually reducing the paperwork that's there. So obviously, if I give my access to my management accounts, I give access to the world. If I provide a simple statement, I'm only giving a fraction of it. So I think, and I've not really answered the question, but I've done it on purpose, is that value exchange will help reduce some of those paper burdens on that front. I also think there's it's a cultural thing and a DNA thing. People's hearts and minds have to move on from this. So it's all right us being all loving data and that tech-savvy approach, but actually, can you convince people to move from that? So that's a different thing. Platforms where you can load data, the Hadoops, all these tools that sit about it, Python R and all these other acronyms that come along, then actually you've now got the ability to really eke out what that data can tell you, what it does, and actually do it in a very sophisticated manner. And I think if you combine, things like open banking, the fact that management accounts are in the cloud, the fact that you guys can sort of combine that and normalize the data, and with all the other APIs and data that's available, then do you get to the point that with that clever analytical tools and the ability to actually use that big data platforms to harness it, that actually we can get to that world? So I think we've still got a long way to go. I think there is a cultural thing around it that needs to be covered. But actually, we can see it in certain organizations that they are now actually moving to that. Now, it's different parts of different organizations, but, I think we can see it. And quite frankly, I take myself, I never print. I don't even know how to use our printers any longer because I've moved on from that. That's because I'm mobile. I don't want to carry it around. But as we all get around to those ideas and those concepts, why do we need paper?
I mean, you both alluded to it, but we are still at the beginning in a lot of respects. Some argue we're halfway, but adoption has been slow, as Richard you referred to, and that's just really with the consumers, not even with SMEs. We're even further behind. There are plans to expand wider than the top 9 banks. There's multi-signatory, there's new product lines, there's deeper data sets. SMEs who have multiple accounts and therefore showing what they want to show to a bank or a lender to get a decision. And then we've also touched on the whole point around risk of fraud and negligence around SMEs and what they share. I mean, so that concludes the value of having multiple data sets. Nick, you talked around traditional data sets. We've talked around what we're getting today. I mean, we're slowly touching on what we'll get in the future. Richard, what's your view on current data sets available? And then Nick, I'll ask you, perhaps you can talk a little how the complementary of multiple data sets through APIs could be a winning recipe.
Yeah, I think we've touched on quite a few different data sources, and I think the ability to stitch those together is clearly one that is a powerful one, to both corroborate and enrich your understanding of the customer, of the borrowing decision, and so on. I think, for example, if you look at accounting software, there's a very, very rich range of potential fields of information in there. I think the skill with that is how accurate is that information. I guess people that work with this data regularly will often find that some of the information has just been input by management, hasn't been reviewed by an accountant, and may not be that reliable. People often find, I think, the sales ledger is more reliable than the expense side. But how do you sort the wheat from the chaff in terms of reliability of data out there? And I know there's a lot of good work going on that from a range of people in the industry to work out, but both where it's fraudulent and where it's just, I guess, bad quality, to try and siphon the good from the bad data there. And I think that's where using other sources like, for example, what Experian already offer, or things like the commercial credit data sharing standards, or things like VAT, if HMRC shares some more information, there's kind of a range of sort of verified and unverified sources that can give you a sort of very full universe of data to do all sorts of use cases. Lending being the most obvious, but you can very much get into things like insights, benchmarking, etc. beyond that.
Ability to be able to take in data sets and actually test an idea in a very short time period enables us to actually understand how we could use that, and actually what the value of actually bringing data into a process. And that's a key thing. I think we all look at APIs, and APIs are very important. They're the translation of something into reality, but actually the formation of the ideas and being able to understand and analyze data and vast quantities of data to see that if we bring in new data sets, what does it tell us about this organization? What does it tell about its propensity to take a product? When is the right time to do it? If we actually look at the management accounts and actually start overlaying other elements to, what's the risk in their customer base, to actually what's the risk of this entity, to how does that actual business perform? Where does it need products? What's the right product? And I think those are great. And if you can actually then understand it from using big data and actually harnessing the power that it brings, then actually we can create interesting use cases and, the ability to consume APIs that tell us anything. And the use cases can then become, well, actually, I want to look at this company does that, they want to do this and the other and something else. They actually have the power to do those use cases. And, I look at it when we were chatting earlier about the fact that actually sat on my mobile phone will be an app that someone will have knocked up. Sitting in the background is 500,000 APIs on your phone. It is that ability to then consume that. And, how can we become, that dynamic that we can pick things up in the financial services in a safe framework, that we can inject new data to tell us new stories and to actually come up with new use cases. So I think, some of the more interesting things are lending's a great one where we can do it, obviously, natural sort of territory. But what about the things that we can actually give back to the SME by actually consuming that data and turning it into real-time intelligence? That actually means that we help the business not have a cash flow issue because we're telling them about the problems, because they may not be aware, they may not be that experienced. And giving those prompts is actually going to help in many more ways. And it's that whole servicing thing, which I think is where there's huge potential. And actually, I don't think we can forget about the fact is, how do we better understand customers to give them that? Some of it's going to be APIs. Some of it is also going to be ingesting data in vast quantities in the background to better understand those customers from a monthly scoring perspective, to understand the risks, because we still, as banks, financial organizations, have to hold capital. So I think it's the use of data, the use of technology to understand the value of that data, and then being able to translate those into use cases and actually create customer journeys that are, rather than a journey of one, actually becomes a journey more suitable to that end user. Rather than segmentation, we come at a segment of one. Okay, that's a bit wishful thinking, but I think, we have the tools now to be able to extract that value.
Just to remind everyone, there is a poll question that should be on your screen, so if you can answer that, we'll come to the results in a moment. Richard, we're going to come into some of the questions that have come through now. Thank you, and please keep sending questions in. We'll try and cover as many as we can in the remaining time. Richard, sort of a broad question, but what does the future of open banking look like?
Very broad. We'll clearly discuss some of it. I mean, listen, I advocated this really strongly to the CMA in 2015 because I do believe that it will be transformative over a 5 to 10 year period. I do think it'll take quite a while for the adoption to build to get there. My hope is that the combination of data sources we've been talking about with open banking, perhaps some of the foundation there, will, over that 5 year plus period, really help to change the market in the favour of the SME customers, to remove where there is sort of pretty excess profits going on right now, and therefore take down some of the pricing where there's excess pricing, to simplify the process of getting finance, to allow much greater choice of finance. So it's not all just tied back to the incumbent bank's business current account. And then to go beyond that and help integrate and simplify the sort of task of running the financial management of that business. So I think that promise is out there for sure. I see a lot of people working towards that, which is great. So I'm pretty confident we'll get there. But I do think it'll take a little while to get the adoption up.
Great. And Nick, I'll ask you the next one. What can non-bank lenders do to increase interaction with open banking?
Very good question, actually. What can you do? So I suppose it's the interaction of being able to, and I suppose this is where it opens the market, is that you can be someone who provides other services to an SME and integrate with that open bank account. So it doesn't, I suppose the principles of that whole open banking doesn't mean it's the banks only who can use the data. It is the financial services industry who can use the data, and other providers, where you can then, in a sense, create hubs of content to actually really help someone manage their business. And I think that's the sort of key element, is that open banking is within a safe and secure environment, is the sharing of that data into multiple different use cases. And the majority of what we've picked up today has been around how this would work in a financial service or banking environment. If you can start adding that value and then turning that into intelligence to help a business, then actually the potential is there for any providers to do that within that regulated FCA environment.
Great. I'm pleased to say we've got the poll answers on screen. I'm most pleased that we don't have anyone that said they don't know. It looks like we've got a good audience. And we also had no one say not that important. So it seems like 47% of you are saying that it's extremely important to collect real-time financials. I know a lot of the people on the call, on the webinar, that they're still not today getting that in real time. It's still a lag of data. It's still relying on old data sets. But it's good that we see this as extremely important, or at least somewhat important as well. A couple more questions that have come through, and I'll ask a little bit controversial, a couple of them. Will, and if so, when will open banking stop being talked about? Do you see, obviously, open? I think we're one of many webinars. There's lots of talk around open banking, not just in the UK but globally. Is there a time when open banking will just become a norm and it will go away? Do you think we're anywhere near that yet?
Is that when you tell me to stop talking? No, I mean, you'd start points earlier, and Richard, it'd be good to get your views afterwards on this, which is, if we take the fact that at the moment it's the adoption rates are low, people are thinking about how they can use it, so therefore it's exciting and that lot. I think once it becomes a standard and that people just use open banking and it's, you want my data, click, off you go, crack on, or there's these platforms, that once that adoption's reached a certain point, then I think it becomes the norm. It's a bit like, we call certain things by certain names and then it becomes, the standard. I call my vacuum a Hoover. It's not a Hoover, it's a vacuum. So when it becomes the norm, then people stop talking about it because it's been adopted. It's part of our DNA. It's part of the natural thing. It's about, people talked about contactless and it went on for years. Nowadays, we go and get the tube, we chuck a phone at it and it works and lets us through the gates. That's just normal. We don't talk about it any longer. It's just the standard. And I think that's the point when people stop, because it becomes part of our financial DNA, for want of a better word.
Richard, how about you?
I couldn't agree more. I think, it's the buzz at the moment, isn't it? It has been for a year or two. It will certainly be for a year or two more, there'll probably be a kind of a disappointment phase where people are a bit, oh my God, these options are still not up. And then it'll hopefully come through that and we'll get mass adoption. I think there's always that hype cycle around anything new. And for sure, we're kind of right at the center of that hype cycle with CMA 9 having gone live and PSD2 going live next year. So yeah, there's definitely too much chat and there needs to be more action. But I think, as I said before, it's going to take a whole bunch of time for the adoption rates to pick up.
A good follow-up question we received around that. We haven't really in this webinar given any tips to other companies about what to do. So one of the questions that came through, in order to get started on a strategy, what are the top things to focus on? Richard, I'll target that back at you first. Is there certain hints and tips or things that people listening in should focus on to get started, if they haven't already?
I mean, customer. So I never start with regulation or technology as a start point. It's what is the customer need that is underserved, and then how do you address that? And thinking about how does data help you address that need. So yeah, I really hate it when people start with API this, API that. It's got to be about what are you trying to solve for the customer. I think all truly great businesses start with that thinking. So yeah, for me, you've got to understand the regulation. You've got to understand the technology in a lot of depth, because otherwise you can't see the innovative ways to solve for that customer need. But knowing the regulation and technology itself does not give you the answer. And I think ultimately, let's be honest, this will be just a core part of how everyone operates in the future. I mean, ultimately, it's a bit like another channel, isn't it? Having your APIs open, you can think about your phone-based staff as a channel. You can think about your mobile app as a channel, and essentially having open APIs that third parties can plug into is another channel. And so, yeah, I think you can think a bit of customer, a bit of channel thinking around it, but for sure, think about what are you trying to achieve here, and how do you keep the customer happy, whether that customer is the end SME or that customer is the intermediate developer.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I was speaking at a conference last week. It was to a bunch of accountants, and a lot of accountants in the industry are talking around the need for using technology. And I said to them, you need to understand why you're using technology, and technology needs to be an enabler to a need.
You know, if we go back to the feedback we had from
SMEs, security. You know, people want to know that they're sharing data in a safe and secure. So if you're going to do something, create something, you're solving a problem. You also have to understand that, what is the message back to that SME to solve that problem, to enable them to share that data, because it is customer consented data at the end of the day. And I think security is those key things. It's got to be there. People have to trust that the data's being shared in a secure way. But at the end of the day, it's all down to what is it that the problem you're trying to solve, and how is the data and how is the principles going to solve it in a journey that people want to go through. And sometimes actually you find the strangest things that come out of stuff where someone might start an idea thinking they're solving this problem and actually solve a completely different problem. So it's actually, I suppose, being fairly open to being agile and seeing what happens. So I think, that thing about a minimum viable product, but actually being able to adapt as things come along quickly to be able to, consume the idea and get people to do it.
Great. I think that summarises it well. So it leaves me to say thank you all for joining today's webinar. Please let us know if you found today interesting and what you'd like to hear in future webinars. I apologise if there was any audio disruption. We got a couple of messages, so we'll look into that if that was on our side. As mentioned in the webinar, there is an advisory note that will follow with the recording of today's webinar. If you would like anyone in your team, your business, to receive this, then please request from info-request@validis.com. Finally, thanks again to Richard and Nick and all of you for listening, and have a great rest of the day.